You're listening to Economics Detective Radio. My guest today is Nathan Smith, Assistant Professor of Business Administration, Finance, and Economics at Fresno Pacific University. And he's here to talk about the economics of migration. Dr. Smith, welcome to Economics Detective Radio.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So my first question's a little tongue-in-cheek, and that is, were you born in Fresno?
No. I moved around a lot when I was a kid. Just moved here 3 years ago after I finished my PhD for a job.
Right. So you yourself, then, are a migrant. So putting on your economist hat, who would you say is benefits from your legal right to migrate to Fresno and take a job there, and who loses, in theory?
Well, let's see. Students would probably benefit because it increases the supply of economics professors in the area. Other economics professors might lose by it, and landlords would benefit because I add a little bit to the demand for housing. But let's see, people who want to park near Fresno Pacific would lose a little bit because I sometimes occupy parking spaces on the street where they live. And if you want to trace all the general equilibrium effects, then it would go on and on. But I think the most direct it would be people that I do business with, whether as a customer or as an employee, will benefit. People that I compete with, mostly as maybe as a customer, I might raise rents a little bit. So, but mostly in labor markets, they could lose out from my being here. Right. There might also be positive spillovers, for example. I mean, I think other economists in the area would actually be happy for me to be here because I'm somebody they can exchange ideas with, somebody they can talk to. So that kind of complicates the picture because a lot of times specialists actually like being close to each other.
Right, and maybe university administrators are complementary with faculty in a sense.
Yeah, sure.
That was, of course, the sort of tongue-in-cheek version, and of course no one's going to deny your political right to move around within your own country anytime soon, or my political right to move around Canada.
In China they would, though. I think there are limits on it there, so that does sometimes happen.
Interesting. But the largest barriers happen at national borders.
Absolutely.
And the sort of slogan among people who would like to reduce those barriers is that it would double world GDP. Can you walk us through the sort of estimates that people have used to come to that? Sounds kind of astounding.
Well, yeah. I mean, I can talk about my own because I've been working on an estimate of my own, which is kind of confirming that result. There has been a variety of estimates ranging from like 67% increase in world GDP to 140, and it's kind of a difficult thing to do because you have to extrapolate so far outside of what we currently see, what we currently experience. So for example, the estimate I was just calculating this morning, and it's based on what I call a pure market clearing approach, which I think is kind of naive, and so I'm going to critique it and then offer some modifications within the same paper, but it's still instructive to think about, is that there'd be about a 91% increase in world GDP. Now, how does this happen? Well, part of it is that people move to places that are just inherently more conducive to productivity. And that could be for natural reasons like climate or geography or closer to roads and infrastructure and seaports and stuff. But I think the biggest reason has to do with institutions and with the way different governments and legal systems and cultures sort of facilitate or don't facilitate efficient networks of specialization and trade. So if you have parts of the world where the legal system is very unreliable and corrupt, then you may be afraid to do business with anybody outside of your own family, except in the most simple spot transactions. So that doesn't facilitate a lot of specialization in trade. And so people end up, you end up with a lot of people being subsistence farmers. You end up with relatively low levels of formal sector employment, and the organizations that you have don't run very well because the way they're regulated and the types of corruption and stuff gets in the way of that. So under open borders, people get to move to places that are just much more conducive to productivity. So that's one factor. Another factor is that there are complementarities between human capital and unskilled labor. So there are some jobs where you basically don't need to know much before you do it. Like a typical person could learn how to do it in a few minutes. Something like picking grapes, for example. Not a very difficult task. Then there are other tasks like my job, teaching economics, which you have to spend years and years studying and kind of shaping your mind and honing your skills in order to be able to do it. Now, rich countries today generally have much higher levels of average human capital than poor countries do. So we have more sophisticated education systems and better health, and there's a lot of different things that go into that. I mean, some of it's probably things like culture, and there are a lot of disputes about what the best ways to measure human capital are. My estimates are sort of distinctive in that I find larger differences in human capital among nations than some people do, but because you have a lot of human capital in rich countries, that means that because unskilled labor is relatively scarce, then it earns a higher wage here. And so basically under open borders, what you do is you have a large influx of unskilled labor from developing countries. So people in rich countries who know how to manage, or in my job, I'd see my earnings go up because there'd be a lot more people who would come in here as students. So there'd be maybe somewhat more economic professors, but that's not that much more because there aren't as many in other parts of the world, and they, to some extent, could migrate anyway. There'd be a lot more students, and so I'd see my earnings go up. And that would be true with managers who could hire a lot more employees at fairly low wages. That would be true with professionals of various kinds who would get a lot more clients. And so all sorts of people who have relatively high human capital would be able to earn more by working with, or in the case of certain kinds of professionals, working for this influx of relatively unskilled migrants who would come in. The unskilled migrants would benefit too, partly because they can work with more skilled people, partly because they live in inherently more productive places. So those are basically the factors that would drive these enormous increases in world GDP that are projected under open borders. But it depends on lots and lots of people moving, and that's one sort of cautionary point that we should always bear in mind.
Yeah, where did the estimates on how many people would move under a more open regime? What's the range of those estimates?
Well, I think it's always in the billions. I haven't calculated what all of those models would project, and it's interesting that sometimes people have sort of highlighted the GDP numbers more than the numbers of migrants. But, I mean, in an earlier draft of this paper, for example, then I was finding, under sort of the naive pure market clearing approach, over 5 billion people move. When I modified the assumptions a little bit in the direction of more realism, I was still finding about 44% of the world population moving. And, I mean, I think people can hear numbers like this, and it sounds crazy, but I don't think it's as crazy as it sounds. I mean, I think that's actually quite plausible that that's what would happen, because if you think about it, why live in a country where you're going to be a lot poorer? Well, maybe you're attached to it because that's where you were born and you'd feel out of place in a new country. But I think one important kind of stylized fact about migration is that what we call diaspora dynamics. When an opportunity to migrate starts, then a few pioneers will take it first. They may move to a country where they don't know anybody, where no one speaks their language, where they don't really have a kind of a cultural home, and it makes a sort of a large burden of adjustment for them. But once they settle there, it's a lot easier for other people to move because there's a diaspora. to settle into. So as the diaspora grows, migration tends to accelerate. And so if you think about the 19th century United States, which is kind of a template for an open border society, because for most of the 19th century we had very little control of migration. We largely allowed anybody to come, and not just the U.S., but most other rich countries were that way at that time. And just from sort of cultural literacy, you might remember things like there'd be a Polish neighborhood, there'd be Irish neighborhoods, there'd be neighborhoods that would get kind of taken over by a certain ethnicity. So new migrants would come and they could settle into the neighborhood, and this wasn't a substitute for assimilation in all cases. Often it was sort of a gateway to assimilation. So you'd settle down in the Italian neighborhood for a little while. When you come over and you barely speak English and you want to be around your own types of people, then as you spend a little bit more time in the United States, then you start to adjust. You start to assimilate. You start to feel more American. You want to branch out. You don't want to be stuck in this little Italian community, that you want to experience the broader society. And so then people will start leaving the diaspora. So there will be a certain amount of assimilation from the diaspora. The diaspora is kind of like a corridor from the home country into the host country. And so once you take that into account, I think you could see enormous levels of migration. I mean, international differences in income are probably larger than they've ever been right now. I mean, they might have fallen a little bit in the past 10 to 20 years or so. There's been a bit of convergence. But, if you compare it to 2 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago, much larger international differences in income. You have much easier transportation ships don't even move people anymore, because people who can afford to get visas to other countries can afford to fly on a plane. But even plane travel is really not very expensive relative to the types of gains you could see from migrating internationally. And you've got English as sort of a global lingua franca, and you've got a certain degree of kind of cultural homogenization around the world. So this sort of cultural globalization has taken place. There are a lot of people who could come to America and feel pretty at home very fast. And there are others who maybe the adjustment would be a little bit more difficult. But when you put all of that together, I think if governments got out of the way, we could see an age of absolutely enormous migration in the next century.
And so before, in the 19th century, there were very few restrictions. So what happened?
Well, a lot of people moved. Tens of millions of people moved around the world. And it's interesting, when people look back on this, they tend to think, well, that worked out great. I mean, there's very few people who wish that the U.S. had closed its borders in 1860. It probably did reduce wages of American workers a little bit in the later part of the 19th century relative to what they would have been. That's controversial. But it certainly allowed the American population to grow a lot faster. And let's see. I mean, there were several other waves of migration. The Chinese moved into places like Southeast Asia. There was a migration of quite a few Indians to Southern Africa. So there was a migration of Europeans into North Africa. And actually some of the other migrations maybe don't look quite as beneficial in hindsight as the mass migration to the U.S. There were migrations to Canada, Australia, so there were some other major kind of recipient countries. Large regions of the world got settled that weren't settled before. And then sometimes people will say, well, the whole world's settled now, so we don't have a frontier. We don't need people to settle empty lands. And that argument doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because there is actually plenty of room to build cities in the United States, for example. But it is true that migration today would probably have a little bit different character, because the world is much more urban than it was then. So it would be more a matter of people moving into cities rather than people moving to the frontier and settling new land. So, yeah, what else? I mean, transportation was not as good back then. You had to take a long voyage across the Atlantic. So the barriers to the sort of natural barriers to mobility were probably higher in those days. And it's interesting that you didn't have a lot of people migrating from, say, Africa to the United States, just getting on a ship and going there. Probably that had a lot to do with racism. So I think racism served also as kind of a barrier on immigration in some cases. But mostly it was a good experience. I mean, it was basically a lot of people moved to places where they really did get better lives. It wasn't a false promise, but people went to America and they really did end up with better lives than they had in Europe. And one thing is, it greatly empowered the United States and, to some extent, Canada and Australia, and sort of parts of the world that ended up being the good guys in World War I and World War II, vis-a-vis Germany, for example. Germany lost a lot of immigrants, and, I mean, just imagine how world history could have been different if the borders hadn't been open in the late 19th century. If all those Germans had stayed in Germany, the U.S. would have been weaker, Germany would have been stronger, and we could have seen a different outcome to the world wars.
I believe many of the commanders were German Americans.
Yeah, that's very interesting too. Yeah, Eisenhower and Nimitz, and some of the leading American generals were actually ethnic Germans, but they served loyally the American Republic and were an important part of winning the war.
But that sort of world is so foreign to today's world, where are there any examples of countries that are just totally open that you can move between today?
Well, so there are open borders within Europe. Europe guards its external borders pretty harshly, but within Europe, if you're in Greece, you can migrate to Germany, you can migrate to Norway. Well, not Norway. Norway's not in the EU, but in the Schengen zone, you'd have freedom of migration, and even if you want to go to Britain. So they're basically within Europe, then there's a lot of open borders, mostly, for the most part, within Western Europe and extending into the other parts of Europe that have become part of the EU, then yes, you can migrate among those countries. But as far as, is there any country that just lets anybody in who wants to come, regardless of where they're from? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is no. This is an area where there are a couple data sets I've been waiting on that are supposed to become available that I think should elucidate that. It's funny that there's great data on trade restrictions. I mean, if you want to go down and figure out exactly who's restricting trade to where and what their rules are, you could get very detailed data on that. But about migration, so far there isn't comparable data. So there's a group at sort of a consortium of universities centered at Harvard, I think, that's called Impala, which has been trying to put together a better data set on that. And that'll be very interesting to look at. But just to be able to sort of compare which countries are more open and which are not. But I think the answer to, are there any countries that have open borders today, the answer is no.
So there's the legal restrictions to migration, but of course it's as a Greek, you speak Greek, and if you don't speak German, then that's going to make it hard for you to make a new life. Does that in Germany? Does that have a big impact on preventing people from moving, even when they have the legal right to do so?
Well, doubtless it does limit it. Yeah. I mean, I think you have a lot of Mexicans who come to the United States, and they'll work in jobs where they don't need to speak English in many cases. Partly there's a certain amount of generalized, like foremen and stuff may know Spanish and stuff by now, but certainly language barriers would impede migration. But how much is an interesting question. And I think in the 19th century then, we didn't get particularly a lot more immigration from England. I guess we did from Ireland, so maybe that would illustrate the language point. But we got lots from Germany, we got lots from Italy, we got lots from places that didn't speak English, and they could settle into a diaspora, find some kind of work, and then learn English in the course of time. So I don't think it's a huge barrier. Just because it's hard to account for, I've actually left it out of the model I'm working on it. I mean, of course, that's a limitation of it. But I think you can move to a new country and learn a new language, and it takes a little while, or you can find a niche where you can get by in your own language. And if the economic incentives are big enough, if there are big enough differences in wages, I think a lot of people would be willing to pay the cost, that cost, the linguistic cost.
Under our current regime, it's very hard if you're a low-skilled, impoverished person in Haiti or Mexico to move to a wealthy country, but there are more sort of openings for higher-skilled people. I was talking to the graduate director of the economics program, and he said that the three countries with the most applicants to the PhD program and the master's program are Canada, because of course we're in Canada, but then China, and then Iran, surprisingly. And I think for a lot of people in Iran, it might be their only way out of a really bad situation where there's very smart, skilled people who probably don't have a lot of opportunities in their native country, but if they can go somewhere else, they could, earn as much as an economist does in Canada or the United States. So are there very many barriers to high-skilled immigration, or is there essential open borders for high-skilled workers?
No, there aren't open borders for high-skilled immigrants. I mean, in the U.S., there's the H-1B visa. It has a cap. The cap is sometimes binding, but in any case, you need to have an employer already willing to sponsor you in order to come. So, I mean, it's a lot easier to do a job search if you're already on the spot, and if your employer is not going to have to go through all the rigmarole of getting you an H-1B visa. And furthermore, then the employer typically has to say there's no American who can do this job. That's a little easier if you're hiring an academic, because academics tend to be sufficiently specialized that it's possible to make a case. We're trying to hire somebody with a specialty in the history of the German economy and small business institutions or something, and then you've narrowed it down to one guy, or at least there aren't very many alternatives. But still, that's a barrier. I mean, it would definitely be a lot harder for high-skilled immigrants to move across international frontiers than within countries. And I think moving into poor countries, it'll also be difficult. There are definitely barriers to high-skilled immigration, but they're not as big. And one thing, there's less differences across countries in how much high-skilled immigrants or high-skilled individuals earn. And I think this reflects partly that they're more mobile across frontiers, but it's partly just that high-skilled immigrants tend to be scarce in poor countries, and so the scarcity tends to raise their incomes, but the poverty of the country tends to lower their incomes, and those effects kind of offset. And so I think that's why you don't see as much variation in what high-skilled people earn as you do in just the wages of unskilled labor.
And one of the sort of critiques of high-skilled migration is that it's a so-called brain drain on the country or place they're leaving. Could you critique that idea?
Yeah, I mean, one problem with it is that to put it, you could just argue against putting it in such a negative light. I mean, if you say, some countries get hurt by brain drain, say, okay, so what? Are the high-skilled immigrants like the property, the serfs of their home countries, and their home countries should be able to just keep them there like forced labor in order to try to improve the local economy? Well, what's the justice in that? I think that's a valid point. I mean, it really isn't appropriate for us to be thinking that we want to restrict the freedom of certain people, force them to stay in countries, maybe countries that are rather oppressive or dangerous for them in some cases, force them to stay there at the expense of their own earnings, their own pursuit of excellence, their own personal fulfillment for the benefit of the country. I mean, why not draft Americans and force them to go there if we think it's appropriate to compel high human capital people to stay in countries like that? So that would be one objection. And I think also, just empirically, is it a fact that brain drain is a big problem? Well, one thing is that if skilled people move to a richer country, they'll probably make more money there. They're likely to send some of it home as remittances, and that will help the local economy too. Second, if it's known that having high levels of skill gives you a chance to get into rich countries, that increases the incentive to acquire those skills if you're in poor countries. So you can actually get a situation where you end up with more skills in poor countries because of brain drain, because what people really want to do is just get out of the country, but since the only way to do it is to get a lot of skills, then they acquire a lot of skills, and then some of them will get out, but some of them won't. And so you can end up with more skilled people in the country than you would without the brain drain happening. And how do those effects offset each other? Well, it's hard to say, and I think the most careful estimates will say it goes one way in some places and the other way in others. So that there probably are some poor countries, especially small poor countries, that are on net hurt by brain drain and might in some sense be better off if we didn't allow people from those countries to emigrate. But there are others that benefit from brain drain because that's helping them to foster human capital. You can also have a case where, let's suppose a skilled worker goes to a rich country and then comes back, bringing with them maybe money they earned in the rich country, maybe skills they acquired in the rich country. So migration can be part of the process of fostering human capital. So I think it would be misguided to try to restrict high-skill immigration because of brain drain. But I also think that rich countries' current policy of discriminating in favor of high-skilled immigrants does tend to cause that problem more than if we let in a more diverse cross-section of immigrants from those countries. So the fact that rich countries are discriminating in favor of skilled immigrants is a source of the problem to the extent that it really is a problem, and it could be solved by rich countries letting in a lot more unskilled workers. So brain drain might be a place from which to challenge the idea that rich countries should be constantly discriminating in favor of high-skilled workers. Open borders, of course, says don't discriminate in favor of high-skilled workers. Basically, let anybody come who wants to come. Maybe tax them a little bit extra if you need to compensate natives for the increased competition. But basically, it should be up to the migrant to decide whether to move, not up to some rich country government.
So, in a recent episode of this show, I interviewed actually another George Mason grad, Deanna Thomas, about political economy. So one thing we didn't cover was Tibu competition, which I think would be particularly relevant here. So could you walk us through Tibu competition and say more generally what the effects of more restrictions or less restrictions are on the politics of the various countries that migrants move to and from?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Tibu competition is a theoretical model about local governments providing public goods. And Tibu's argument, which sort of goes too far, is that local governments will provide the right amount of local public goods because they're competing with each other for residence. And so basically when you move to an area, you pay a certain tax, but in return you get public services. And you'll pick an area that has the combination of taxes and public services that's most appealing to you, and you'll end up with an optimal package of taxes and public goods. Now, this is too idealistic. I mean, for one thing, local governments aren't profit maximizers like that. For another, there are huge transactions cost to migrating among jurisdictions. But I think it is true that when people have the option of exiting, then that does affect the types of policies that are adopted. So in the U.S. case, for example, if you look at the national government, the taxes there are a lot more progressive than at the state governments. Tibu competition explains why that is. If state governments, and city governments too, the same argument applies to them, if they adopt very progressive taxation schemes, rich people won't want to live there, because that means that most of the tax burden falls on the rich. So the rich are going to move somewhere else. And then poor people might move in more so, because then it means little of the tax burden falls on them. And so you change the composition of your tax base and make it considerably poorer. At that point, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So progressive taxation schemes look a lot less appealing when voters can enter and exit. Now, if you think about this on the international level, then if you have open borders, if you have freedom of migration, the citizens of any given state will have a lot more opportunities to emigrate somewhere else. And so, if that government chooses to impose high taxes and engage in a lot of redistribution from rich citizens to poor citizens, then the rich citizens are going to have more of a desire to leave, and because of open borders, they'll also have a lot of opportunity to leave. That means that governments are going to foresee this, and in order to avoid driving away their wealthy citizens, then they will tend to resist high taxes. So in that sense, Tibu competition among jurisdictions can provide kind of a protection against redistributive taxation, and so that's a reason to expect that open borders would lead to smaller governments, not only directly, because open borders is directly a move in the direction of small governments. It means governments doing one less thing. It's not coercing people to stay. It reduces government's power. It reduces the functions of government directly. But it could also do it indirectly through this Tibu competition mechanism, which is that the governments they'd want to bring down the tax burden in order to avoid driving away their wealthiest citizens. So, but that's not the only impact. And I think if you do let people migrate and then move to new countries and vote immediately, then you could get a situation in the United States, for example, where lots and lots of very poor people from all over the world migrate here, and then they say, oh, there's all these rich Americans that we're living among. Let's tax them a lot and then just redistribute the money to us. I mean, that's not a desirable situation. I think that would just be sort of directly inefficient, because you'd have people moving not because they were more productive somewhere else, but because they would get more handouts somewhere else. And that's why open borders advocates like myself and my colleagues at openborders.info, we do tend to stress that just moving can't mean automatically getting the right to vote. You do have to separate those things. We would advocate open borders for residency, but not for necessarily political rights, citizenship, voting, and things like that.
Right. So I think a piece of evidence that, at least from government's perspective, oppressive governments, migration is a threat, is something like the Berlin Wall. You wouldn't have to erect that. The Soviets wouldn't have had to put up a wall to keep their people in if they didn't legitimately fear that exit would undermine their power.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very good example. I mean, Germans were leaving East Berlin. They didn't like living under communism, so they started going to West Berlin, which was still under capitalist control. And to prevent that from happening, then the Soviets put up the Berlin Wall. But the irony is that today, not very many authoritarian governments are preventing emigration. A few do, but mostly they don't. Mostly emigration is prevented because the host countries won't accept them. So in some ways, it's now the West that's building Berlin walls to keep people out, instead of authoritarian governments building Berlin walls to keep people in. And from a geopolitical perspective, I think this is quite damaging to us. I mean, if you look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, for example, polls show lots of Russians would like to move to the U.S. I saw one recently, I think it was saying a majority of Russian students now would like to move to the West if they could. But and that would be great geopolitically, because they wouldn't be living under Putin and paying taxes to him and listening to his propaganda and serving in his army to invade other countries and stuff. They'd be living somewhere else under a democracy where you have a free press, be much healthier for the development of their minds and their opinions, and they wouldn't pose a threat to the rest of the world. And the fact that it's in a sense, it's very perverse for us to trap people in places where they're a threat to us, instead of letting them come in peacefully to live the kind of way of life that we think it would be better if more people lived. And it's even worse than that, because why does Russia feel such a stake in Ukraine? Why did they feel the need to conquer Crimea? I think some of this has to do with the fact that as the European Union has expanded, Russians have needed visas to get to more and more places. So the territory of Ukraine in Soviet times, of course, they had free access to it. After Soviet times, they still basically did. But if Ukraine joined the EU, they wouldn't anymore. And they love to vacation in Crimea, so it's understandable they don't like the idea of Ukraine joining the EU. And so, I mean, I think this is kind of an example of where competition for territory may be heating up in the world. Hopefully not too much. Hopefully Crimea isn't the beginning of more things to come, but it may be. And so there could be big geopolitical advantages to rethinking territory a little bit and saying, well, okay, maybe Russians shouldn't. We don't think Russians should conquer Crimea from Ukraine, but maybe it is fair to say, okay, this has been part of your country for a long time. Maybe we should recognize a right to come there on vacation, a right to move there to visit, that kind of thing. And so open borders can partly, I think, it can serve to split the idea of who should have jurisdiction in an area, who should be making the laws, making the rules, governing a place, from who has a right to be present there. It doesn't have to be the same answer to those two questions, and if it weren't, there'd be a lot more options for how to try to maintain world peace. What
would you say to the sort of restrictionist argument that people should stay in their own countries and be political activists and make the institutions there better rather than going from where institutions are bad to where institutions are good?
Oh, man, I do not like that argument. I mean, one problem with it is, and this is something you can think about in the U.S. too, how likely is your vote to affect an election?
Almost zero, yeah.
Basically no chance, because and I mean the 2000 election sort of proved the point, because the election hung on like 500 votes, and it was amazingly close. Still nobody's individual vote mattered. So, well, people still vote, they still follow politics, then, but can you realistically change the direction of the country? I mean, mostly no. Mostly people go about their own affairs. If you like to do it, fine. If you like to engage in political activism, but if you're in a place like Russia and you have a family, if you start participating in an NGO, your business can get taken. You could get, it's hard to know exactly what's going on there, but you get beaten up by thugs. Some people have ended up getting, like Magnitsky, probably getting murdered. I mean, it's very dangerous and very unlikely to work. So, and furthermore, people who would engage in that, I mean, it takes skills, it takes connections, and also in the best case, you realize your own ideology. But do most of those people have ideologies that we would want to govern countries? I mean, if you think about the people who have changed regimes in their home countries, a lot of them are pretty bad. People like Fidel Castro. Would we rather that Fidel Castro changed Cuba if he was unhappy with the Batista regime? Are we glad that he overturned it and established a new regime, or do we wish that he'd just migrated to Miami? Well, I think we'd rather that he migrated to Miami rather than create a revolution in Cuba. And so, I think that's a very unrealistic and kind of irresponsible argument. It's just that's just something people say when they really have not thought it through very well.
And of course, so there's a sense in which you know your own interests better than you know the interests of the whole society. So the choice to move is an individual choice, whereas the choice to institute socialism in Cuba is a choice that affects many people, and it's hard for one person to, even if they're a career economist, to really know what the best policy is.
Yeah, sometimes maybe if there was somebody who was a really smart career economist, and they had been fighting the battle within their home country, and then they went abroad, maybe sometimes I'd think, I wish they'd stayed at home and tried to change things there. But I think even that would be rare, because if you go abroad, let's suppose you do want to change the regime in your home country, and maybe you have pretty good ideas about how to do it. Are you more likely to be able to change it from within your country or going abroad someplace? A lot of times your best bet may be to go abroad. There you can earn more money, which you could channel back to the causes you believe in your home country. There you may have freedom of speech. So you can speak out against the regime. Whereas, you can write things in the United States that if you'd written them under the Batista dictatorship in Cuba or under Putin's regime in Russia or something, you'd either have been silenced or killed. But when you're in the United States, you can write them. So you may be more effective at trying to change your home society for the better if you migrate than if you don't. And in fact, if you look at history, this is, I think, one of a very important and maybe underappreciated argument for open borders. Lots of people moved from Western Europe to the United States in the 19th century. They sort of absorb American values while they're in the U.S., but they're still interested in their home countries. In many cases, then, the influence of these diasporas helps to foster democratic movements in the countries that they were from. I mean, a case right after World War II, it looked fairly likely that the communists might take over much of Western Europe at that time. And the U.S. sort of was mobilizing Italian immigrants, for example, to write back to their relatives in Italy and say, don't vote for the communists, vote for the Democrats. And it worked. And now today, Western Europe is pretty much all democratic. Yeah, I mean, I think without exception, all the countries in the EU are democracies. I guess Hungary might be turning into a little bit of an exception, unfortunately. But I think this owes a lot to the influence of migration, of the European diasporas in the United States, who then channeled influences back to the places that they were from and turned them into democracies too. More recently, you have Mexico. So Mexico was sort of a revolutionary dictatorship for most of the 20th century. It's never really been democratic in its history until 2000, and at that point, since then, you've had a democracy in Mexico. You've really had democratic elections. You've had alternation of power between different parties, and well, I'm not enough of an expert in Mexican politics to say how much this had to do with migration, but certainly there was a lot of migration going on at that time. You had a lot of people moving into the United States, sometimes moving back, sometimes influencing their relatives across the border. Did this play a part in the democratization of Mexico? I'd be very surprised if it didn't. The Philippines is another example. Sends lots of migrants to the United States, ends up turning into a democracy. So I think if you want people with democratic values to change their home countries around the world, then having them send a lot of immigrants to democratic countries like the United States, seeing how things work, gaining some experiences, and then maybe going back with their new ideas, or maybe just writing home or sending money back to support certain kinds of parties and so on, that's probably a much better bet than having them try to stay where they are now.
The next objection I think is silly, but I'm going to ask because I'm such a history buff, but weren't the Visigoths immigrants too?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. So the Roman Empire had basically let in lots of Germans for quite a while. And as long as they were coming in peacefully, a lot of them were even serving in the legions, but as long as they were coming in peacefully and as individuals or as small groups, they didn't cause any problems. The Visigoths were a special case because the Romans let them immigrate as a polity, so as like under their own leaders, and it's as if instead of allowing people to immigrate from Ireland, we allowed like the Irish government and prime minister and everything to just like set up shop on the territory of Georgia or something. And you could ask, well, why did the Romans do this? And well, partly, I mean, the Roman Empire was pretty weak by this time, and they were pretty reliant on, any soldiers they can get, and a lot of times that would be people immigrating from Germany. And so that when the Visigoths promised to guard their frontier, that sounded pretty appealing to them. And the Visigoths wanted to migrate to the Roman Empire because they were afraid of a new barbarian tribe coming out of Central Asia called the Huns. So they begged the Romans to let them in. And so they were a little bit like refugees, but the problem is that they came in under their own leaders. They came in as a polity. And then I think the Roman regime by this time was very corrupt. Somehow disputes broke out, and the Visigoths end up taking Rome. But the interesting thing is, who was on the other side? The last defender of Rome was a guy named Stilicho. Now, we don't know much about him, but from his name, that's not a Roman name. That's a German name. And Stilicho was murdered as a result of a plot within the palace. And so if they hadn't murdered Stilicho, would Rome have fallen? Probably not. Why did they murder him? I mean, I think by this time Roman politics is such a snake pit. So, I mean, sometimes this is, partly facetious, but I say, Rome fell because these nativist know-nothings in the capital who didn't like this German general murdered the only guy who would do the job the Romans wouldn't do anymore, which was to defend Rome. So it's to represent this as a case of this shows the dangers that immigrants can pose. That's really very naive, and it doesn't have much to do with history. What the history lesson really teaches is that if you do let in a lot of immigrants, and if you incorporate them, let them be incorporated into your society, they can strengthen your society. In fact, the Eastern Roman Empire did a better job of this. They ended up with various types of foreigners on the throne. They let in a lot of barbarian invaders and would sort of co-opt them in various ways. I mean, sometimes they even let them in as polities under their own leaders, and they managed to last for another 1,000 years. I think America today, we don't need to follow either Roman model. I mean, American society today is very dynamic, very capable of assimilating immigrants from all over the world. There are lots of people who really they do just want to come in here peacefully. I mean, we're not faced with we do have to, not that there are no national security concerns. I mean, terrorists are another matter, and I think that that you do have to try hard to keep them out. That I think is something that we sometimes call it the national security exception to open borders. The few people who really do represent genuine terrorist threats, by all means, try to exclude them, and I'd even be willing to say make that exception could be made rather large. I mean, even people who are not that likely to be terrorists, if there is some reason to suspect them, then maybe exclude those people, because it is very important to prevent terrorism. But the vast majority of people who are coming into the U.S., who want to come into the U.S., nobody's even claiming that they're a terrorist threat. It's perfectly clear. They just want to come in here, settle within American society, and work for a living. And so I think, in that case, the national security argument doesn't apply, and it's not even believed by the government. It's not even claimed by the government. I think the national security argument against freedom of migration is valid, but it's not a justification for the policies that we have now. The policies we have now are not designed to protect national security. That's not their goal. Their goal seems to be labor protectionism. They're trying to protect American workers from foreign competition in the labor market. That's the way to make sense of them. And so I think it's an economic debate, and national security is a little bit of a red herring, at least as far as arguing about current immigration policy.
So we've had two examples, one in ancient Rome and then Eisenhower and Nimitz in World War II, of German immigrants serving in the militaries of their new homes. The Germans also bring I believe, piano making and beer brewing wherever they go. There are these examples of cultural groups not just moving over to a new place and working in the industries that are already there, but actually founding whole new industries. Is that a major factor in?
Oh, sure. I mean, you can see that. Well, so in the late 19th century, people like Nikola Tesla, Andrew Carnegie, major contributors to the Industrial Revolution that was going on then, they're immigrants. If you look today at the tech sector in Silicon Valley, lots of immigrants. People like Sergey Brin, co-founder of Google, immigrant from Russia. Or Elon Musk, he's from South Africa, I believe, the head of Tesla Motors. And this is a common phenomenon. Immigrants are disproportionately entrepreneurial. So I think this is partly just immigrants bring new ideas with them, and they'll have slightly different ways of doing things, and so those can kind of creatively interact with native patterns of development. Sometimes they may face discrimination. So one reason you start a business might be because you can't get a formal sector job because people discriminate against you, and that may be invidious discrimination, that they don't like you on racial grounds, or maybe they just can't quite relate with you because you don't seem the same as them, so they don't give you the job. So you're left on the outside, and you have to come up with your own way to make a living, and that turns you into an entrepreneur. So what exactly are the reasons for it are hard to say. There's probably a lot of factors that go into it. But one thing about the age of open borders, if you go back to 1870 or so to 1914, this is a phenomenally creative technological period, even to the extent that economists like Robert Gordon or Tyler Cowen, experts in history of productivity, are seeing the second industrial revolution as the biggest era of technological progress, really, in world history. And the first half of the 20th century, when we had quite rapid growth in productivity, sometimes the economy wasn't doing very well for other reasons, like government meddling and bad monetary policy and stuff. But as far as the productivity growth, the actual way we were doing things, there was tremendous progress, and you can see this in changes in our material living standard, like cars, for example. Cars becoming something that everybody drives. Electricity. Lots of home appliances. Everybody having a refrigerator. Everybody having indoor plumbing. Means of transportation, so airplanes arising then. And so really just a transformation in the way of life. And if you think about the way the typical American lived in 1890 versus 1950, vast changes. Watching TV, listening to the radio, just everything in an American household in 1950. Most of it is new. Whereas 1950 to 2010, not that different. We still watch TV, we still listen to the radio, we still have cars parked in the driveway, we still live in the same kind of standalone houses. Maybe in some cases they're a little bigger, but and we do have computers that we didn't have then, and we have cell phones that we didn't have then. Those are big things. Those are important breakthroughs, but they're only two compared to sort of across the entire front of the way we lived being transformed from 1890 to 1950. Now, does this have something to do with open borders? I think it probably does. I mean, for one thing, you get the immigrant entrepreneurialism per se, but another thing, if you think about Ford's plants in Detroit, what was Ford's huge innovation? It's not that he invented cars. Cars had been invented well before he came along. Ford has a novel production method. I mean, he was a good mechanic, too. He knew how to make cars maybe better than other people in some respects, but the key really was he makes an assembly line. On the assembly line, everybody has one very simple task. He doesn't need to hire very sophisticated technicians who know how to make an entire car. No, you just need to learn one little task. He's economizing on human capital.
Right.
And that, I think, we haven't seen as much of that in the later part of the century, and partly it's because why economize on human capital when you don't have access to that much unskilled labor anyway? So innovation has taken this form where it's really skill biased, and I think if you had open borders, you'd have an incentive for technology to develop in a different way, where technology would learn to, suddenly you have vast numbers of immigrants from poor countries coming in. You want to put them to some use. You'd get human capital saving technological change like what Ford did. I think it would accelerate technological change. In some ways, I may be reaching beyond what I can really clearly establish here, but at least that would be my vision for what would happen. It's not the full case for open borders, but it's part of it.
A friend from Brazil was saying that, I mean, Brazil's a much poorer country than Canada or the United States, but it's very common for some people to have a maid to do their cleaning. And here, I guess an example of a low-skilled labor-saving innovation would be the Roomba. So we can't afford a maid because we have very, very few sort of low-skilled workers because we keep them all out. So instead we invent the Roomba, which probably wouldn't have needed to be developed and marketed in a world with more low-skilled labor moving across national borders.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So there will be many tasks which you might do for yourself which don't require all your skills. You could hire someone else to do them, but in the U.S., since the supply of unskilled labor is, in a sense, artificially restricted because we don't allow it. People who would be happy to come, we don't allow them to come. Then people will end up painting their own houses, mowing their own lawns, watering their own yards, who might make $30, $40, $50 an hour. Now, from the point of view of global economics, this doesn't make a lot of sense. They should be outsourcing those services to other people. So under open borders, I think you would see a lot more household servants. And it would be interesting to see how people would adapt to that culturally. I mean, to some extent, that's already happened, of course. People will hire Mexican immigrants to clean their houses, and sometimes this turns into scandals when politicians turn out to have hired somebody for these domestic tasks who wasn't illegal, and maybe they knew, maybe they didn't, but I don't hold it against them myself. But sometimes this becomes a scandal. But yeah, I think you'd see a lot more household servants, but I think you'd see a lot more drivers. So that's another example. Seniors a lot of times can't really drive safely. Driving isn't that high-skilled of a job, but to hire an American to be a full-time driver, that's more expensive. So I think that's not affordable for a lot of people. It would be under open borders. I think elder care actually, let's suppose you want to take care of your mom in your home, but it takes a lot of work. Well, if you had a global labor market, it would be a lot easier to find somebody who would look after your mom in your house. Nannies, that's another example. Again, not a very high-skilled job, and a lot of women nowadays will find themselves in a case where they might have gotten a lot of education. I mean, women are getting more education by some measures than men are now. But then what happens when you get married and want to raise a family? Well, it doesn't work that well to have two incomes. Who looks after the kids during the day? Under open borders, that'd be less of an issue because you could hire people from poor countries who'd be happy to come here and take care of your kids, maybe be a live-in maid or a live-in nurse or nanny, for much lower wages than what Americans would demand, and wages that might be affordable to a lot of people who are not rich, but middle-class people. So those would be some examples of ways that immigrants could be incorporated into the economy. But I think we'd also see different kinds of housing developments, and it's hard to foresee, of course, everything that would happen. But you'd see a lot of changes, and some of them people would have trouble adjusting to, just because people are sort of conservative in their habits. So but changes that people would really benefit from.
So, last question: do you see a lot of hope for a more open borders regime in the future?
Well, maybe not a lot, but I think there's some. I mean, this has been an issue in U.S. politics for the last 15 years or so. I mean, there was an amnesty in 1986. The word amnesty has become politically radioactive, but at the same time, we face an interesting dilemma because deporting millions of people, some who have been here for 20 years, many of whom have U.S. citizen children who are an important part of the economy, especially in certain sectors, and who have strong social ties here by now, to just round them all up and deport them is appalling to think about. And I think a lot of people realize that is unrealistic. I mean, they should realize that it's just totally morally appalling and should be just completely unthinkable, and a lot of people don't realize that, but they do kind of at least see that that's not really a practical option. So what do we do? I mean, we can adopt harsher domestic enforcement, but this interferes with the freedom of everybody. And so most people do support some kind of legalization, some kind of normalization of the status of these people, and it's mostly, I think, a fight over exactly what form that'll take. But it is hard to pin down, hard to agree on, and there is this kind of populist resistance, I think, to it. But will it happen at some point? Yeah, I think it kind of has to. But then what happens after that? I mean, that's not open borders, of course. It's not anywhere close. But the thing is, anything we do to regularize the status of people who are here will increase the incentive of more people to come. No matter how much we say, well, okay, we'll give amnesty to these ones, but that's the last time, never again, then, well, of course we're going to say that now, but are we really going to hold to that?
Right, it's very hard for a government to commit.
So then people are going to want to come because we'll create expectations of another amnesty in future. And of course, we'll be faced with the same dilemma then. That, we really can't conscientiously deport millions of people who have social ties here and have lived here for a long time, maybe don't have a home anywhere else. We'll have the children of immigrants to deal with. We'll have people like the Dreamers who came here as children and who don't maybe even know any other place. And so the problem is that our current regime, it's not incentive compatible. We want the rule of law, but we can't have it under the current system because the laws aren't incentive compatible, because the laws are trying to forbid a lot of things that aren't morally wrong. You don't have conscience as an ally because coming across the border illegally in order to try to make enough money to support your family is not a morally wrong thing to do. It's a good thing to do. It's a morally brave, sometimes a heroic thing to do. And so people aren't going to turn in an illegal immigrant the way they would turn in a runaway murderer, because it would be wrong to turn in an illegal immigrant, and they know it. Their conscience tells them that you'd be, a scoundrel if you turn in so-and-so who's working hard for a living and never did you any harm. And so when the law parts company with conscience, then it loses its enforceability, at least in any kind of a decent society, and we are to some extent a decent society. And so I do tend to see a gradual erosion of migration controls. It's not a certainty. I mean, it's basically a choice between erosion of migration controls and becoming more and more barbaric and losing our commitments to human rights and so on. But I think that those are somewhat robust. And I mean, the Christian churches are an interesting case here because they do tend to be well to the left. They're obviously to the right of the median voter on some issues, but they tend to be well to the left of the median voter on immigration issues. And that's true even of conservative churches like the Southern Baptists. I mean, obviously you have a lot of liberal churches who are very pro-immigrant, but even conservatives like the Southern Baptists or the Catholics are quite pro-immigration. In fact, I've quoted some statements by the Catholic Church on my blog, on our blog, the Open Borders blog, and they're amazingly favorable. I mean, I don't even feel like I have to dissent from them much at all. I might expand on certain points in a certain way, but I can basically just quote what they say, and it's an open borders argument. And so I think the Christian churches could play an important role here. They played a crucial role in the end of slavery, so that gives me some hope. And so I think in the end I do see hope for the world moving in the direction of open borders, but it will take a lot of moral will, and it basically depends on whether we make moral progress and become better human beings. And we can't become better human beings and not open the borders more, because that's just it's too crucial. It touches on too many other issues, and the way we'd have to conduct ourselves to really stop people from seeking a better life here, really effectually stop that, are just so bad that it couldn't help but just erase the moral progress that we've achieved in most other respects. Moral progress isn't guaranteed. I mean, we saw in the early part of the 20th century in Europe a lot of moral retrogression. People became a lot worse than they'd been. The types of things that they did were much worse than what they'd done before. That could happen again. But I think the larger trend in history, with lots of setbacks, but the larger trend is towards moral progress. And I think that will continue, and I think open borders is just inevitably part of that.
Where can my listeners find you online?
Openborders.info. That's Open Borders the Case, if you look it up on Google. I've been blogging there for a couple of years. I published it a number of other places too, but that would be the main place to look, because we've got a lot of materials there making the case for open borders, looking at it from a lot of different sides. We blog there. We have kind of the permanent case sort of set up in the background, and so that's probably the best place on the internet, I think, to look for information about open borders.
Nathan Smith, thank you very much for being on Economics Detective Radio.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode of Economics Detective Radio, you can head over to economicsdetective.com for additional content and links. The music for this podcast was created by Cassandra McLeod, who you can find at soundcloud.com under the stage name Minaret. That's M-I-N-A space R-E-T.